Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy inspiring tales like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel, BI. Meanwhile, at Los Angeles International Airport, the usual hustle and bustle filled the air. Travelers hurried through the terminals, luggage wheels rolling across the polished floors, and snippets of conversations blended into a steady hum. The airport was a melting pot of emotions. Excitement, anxiety. Luggage rolled in all directions, blending seamlessly with the constant flow of people moving through the busy terminal. Amidst the chaos, one man stood out, not because of extravagance but because of his quiet composure. That man was Keanu Reeves. He was dressed simply in a plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots that told stories of countless journeys. Over his shoulder hung a well-used backpack, its faded fabric suggesting it had accompanied him to many corners of the world. There was nothing flashy about his appearance, no designer labels, no extravagant accessories. Perhaps it was for this reason that he mostly went unnoticed by the hurried travelers around him. Yet, for those who took the time to observe closely, there was something undeniably different about him. It wasn't just his appearance, it was the calmness he radiated. He seemed like someone who had mastered the art of stillness, someone who refused to let the chaos of the world disrupt his inner peace. Despite the swirling chaos of the airport, passengers rushing, announcements blaring, and the constant shuffle of footsteps, Keanu remained tranquil. He stood there, observing his surroundings with a quiet curiosity, as if taking in every detail without feeling the need to hurry. While others anxiously checked their phones, paced impatiently, or sighed in frustration, Keanu simply existed in the moment. He didn't seem to mind the occasional glances thrown his way or the stark contrast between himself and the other first-class passengers, who were draped in luxury from head to toe. Keanu's presence exuded a quiet confidence that made him stand out without trying. Right behind him in the line stood Victor Harding, a stark contrast to Keanu in every imaginable way. Victor was dressed in an impeccably tailored, expensive suit, his polished leather shoes gleaming under the bright airport lights. The sharp scent of his cologne lingered in the air, demanding attention before he even spoke. Every movement he made was deliberate and calculated, as if he had rehearsed them 1,000 times to project an image of success and power. Victor wasn't just standing in line, he was making a statement. He was someone important, and he wanted the world to know it. Victor's sharp eyes scanned the first-class line, assessing each passenger with the critical gaze of someone who believed he belonged at the top. When his eyes landed on Keanu, dressed in his simple attire, Victor couldn't resist making a comment. "First class, huh?" he said with an ironic smile, his voice dripping with condescension. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned his head slowly and met Victor's gaze, his expression remaining calm and unreadable. "Yeah," he replied evenly. "The world is full of surprises." Victor frowned slightly, clearly expecting a bigger reaction, perhaps a sign of insecurity or discomfort from the man he had just judged. But Keanu remained unfazed, his serene demeanor making it clear that the remark had little impact on him. The silence stretched for a moment, and Victor, not one to let things go so easily, decided to push further. "Look," Victor continued with a forced chuckle, his voice laced with subtle arrogance. "Nothing personal, but you don't exactly fit the typical first-class profile. It's not every day you see someone so casual in a place like this." Victor leaned in slightly, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. "Nothing personal, but you don't seem like the type who flies like this," he said, chuckling softly. His eyes scanned Keanu's worn-out jeans and scuffed boots with thinly veiled amusement. "It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." Keanu offered a small, knowing smile, but didn't respond right away. He simply adjusted the strap of his backpack and gazed ahead as if Victor's words were no more than background noise. His calm demeanor remained unshaken, making it clear that he wasn't affected by the remark. Just then, the announcement came through. It was time to board. The first-class line began moving forward, and Keanu and Victor, now side by side, advanced without exchanging another word. Victor walked with firm, confident strides, his posture radiating the self-assurance of someone who believed he belonged among the elite. In contrast, Keanu moved at his own unhurried pace, seemingly oblivious to the bustling crowd around him. He took everything in without rushing, maintaining the same composed energy as before. As they stepped onto the plane, the unexpected happened. Upon reaching his designated seat, Victor glanced at his ticket once more, then looked up in disbelief. Keanu was settling into the seat right next to his. As Victor reached his seat, he glanced down at his ticket one more time to confirm. Looking up, his face twisted in disbelief as he saw Keanu settling into the seat right next to his. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered under his breath, shaking his head in frustration. He dropped into his seat with an audible sigh, letting out a low chuckle, as if the entire situation were some kind of joke. "Of all the places possible, it had to be here," he mumbled, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Keanu, as always, remained composed. He turned to Victor with that same calm, polite smile. "Looks like we're traveling together then," he said, his voice even and unbothered. Victor crossed his arms tightly, shifting in his seat as he tried to suppress his growing discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting next to Keanu. It was the thought of sharing such an exclusive space with someone he had already deemed unworthy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about Keanu's effortless tranquility unsettled him. As the cabin filled with the murmurs of passengers settling in, Victor kept stealing sideways glances at Keanu, searching for something, anything, that would validate his initial assumptions. But Keanu, unfazed, leaned back in his seat, completely at ease with his surroundings. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting next to Keanu. It was the unsettling realization that the man he had judged only minutes ago was now sharing the same exclusive space as him. Victor couldn't quite explain why, but Keanu's presence made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't ignore. As the last of the economy-class passengers boarded and the cabin doors were secured, Victor found himself unable to sit in silence any longer. His curiosity, and perhaps a hint of insecurity, compelled him to break the ice, though not in a particularly friendly manner. "So, what do you do for a living?" Victor asked, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone who already believed they knew the answer but just wanted confirmation. His smirk suggested he expected something unimpressive, something that would validate his earlier assumptions. Keanu, who was calmly adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up with a composed expression. He paused for a brief moment before replying, "I work in film." Victor raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Oh yeah? What kind of film work? Commercials? Small-time projects?" he asked, his tone dripping with subtle condescension. Keanu simply gave a small, patient smile. "Something like that," he responded, offering no further details. Victor leaned back in his seat, clearly unimpressed. "Interesting," he muttered, as if filing Keanu away in his mind under the category of ordinary. Little did he know, the truth would soon shatter his assumptions. Keanu tucked his backpack neatly under the seat in front of him, then looked up and answered simply, "I work in film." Victor raised his eyebrows in feigned surprise, leaning slightly toward Keanu. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time stuff?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of condescension, as if expecting Keanu to confirm his preconceived notions. Keanu gave a slight smile and shook his head gently. "Something like that," he replied, offering nothing more. Victor laughed, shaking his head as if amused. "You know, I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place," he said, his voice dripping with self-assured arrogance. "But sometimes, certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance." Keanu looked at him for a long moment, his gaze calm and thoughtful. He seemed to be assessing the situation, weighing his response carefully. Finally, he spoke in his usual composed tone. I think we all have our place, Keanu replied evenly. And sometimes it's exactly where we are. Victor scoffed lightly, shaking his head in disbelief at Keanu's philosophical response. That's cute, he said. But real life doesn't work that way. Keanu didn't react to Victor's dismissive tone. Instead, he simply turned his gaze back to the window, taking in the clouds outside as if they were far more interesting than the conversation at hand. His serenity, however, only seemed to frustrate Victor more. Sometimes, it's exactly where we are, Keanu replied calmly, his words carrying a quiet wisdom. Victor let out a short, dismissive laugh. That's nice. Kind of philosophical even. But real life isn't that simple, he said, leaning back in his seat with a smug grin. Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the window, as if signaling that the conversation was over. He seemed content to let Victor have the last word, unwilling to engage in pointless debates. But Victor wasn't done yet. He leaned slightly toward Keanu, his voice lowering but still laced with arrogance. You know what? He said, his smirk growing. You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never really belong to certain people. This time, Keanu didn't reply with words. Instead, he turned to Victor with an expression that combined patience and quiet confidence. His calm eyes held a depth that words couldn't convey, silently challenging the assumptions Victor had made about him. Victor shifted slightly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under Keanu's steady gaze. It was a look that spoke volumes, one that carried experience, humility, and a silent understanding of the world far beyond the material luxuries Victor held so dear. Keanu's expression held a blend of patience and quiet firmness, the kind of look that said more than words ever could. It wasn't confrontational, nor was it dismissive. It was simply steady, unwavering, and filled with an unshakable confidence that seemed to transcend the moment. Victor, realizing his provocation hadn't elicited the reaction he was hoping for, leaned back into his seat with a smug, satisfied smile. In his mind, he believed he had the upper hand. He thought he had successfully asserted his dominance, comfortably fitting Keanu into a box that suited his assumptions. What Victor didn't realize, however, was that things were only just beginning. He was convinced he controlled the narrative, but Keanu's unwavering calmness masked something Victor couldn't yet comprehend. With each passing minute, what had started as a simple exchange of words was slowly evolving into something far more significant. Beneath the surface, a quiet lesson was unfolding, one that Victor was completely unprepared for. The low hum of the engines signaled that the plane was now airborne. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles preparing for in-flight service, Victor glanced at Keanu once more, still unable to shake the unsettling feeling that his seatmate's simplicity was far more complex than it appeared. As the plane cruised smoothly through the sky, the in-flight service began. The flight attendant moved gracefully through the first-class cabin, offering drinks to the passengers. Victor, always eager to make an impression, seized the opportunity. With a confident smile, he raised his hand and said, "A glass of champagne, please. Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." His tone was dripping with self-importance, as if the drink itself was a symbol of his status. The flight attendant, accustomed to such requests from high-profile passengers, offered a polite professional nod and swiftly poured his champagne. Victor leaned back, savoring the moment, glancing around to ensure others noticed his refined choice. When it was Keanu's turn, he offered a small, polite smile and simply said, "Just water, please." Victor, who had been watching closely, didn't miss the chance to comment. He turned to Keanu with the same air of superiority and let out a chuckle. "Water?" he asked incredulously, his eyebrows raising in amusement. "Don't tell me you're going to waste a first-class experience with water." Keanu accepted the bottle from the flight attendant with a calm nod, unaffected by Victor's tone. "I'm fine with this," he replied, his voice steady and unbothered. "Sometimes, simplicity is enough." Victor narrowed his eyes as if trying to decipher whether Keanu was serious or just being pretentious. But no matter how he looked at him, Keanu's relaxed demeanor remained unchanged, making Victor feel increasingly uneasy. Victor let out a near laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience of flying first class with water," he scoffed, clearly amused by what he saw as Keanu's lack of appreciation for luxury. Keanu took the bottle from the flight attendant with his usual composed demeanor, twisting the cap open effortlessly. "I'm fine with this," he said calmly, taking a sip. "Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing Keanu's response as if trying to decipher whether it was genuine or some kind of subtle mockery. He drummed his fingers lightly on the armrest, contemplating his next move before deciding to push the conversation further. "Yeah," Victor said with a smirk. "I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." His words were laced with arrogance, making it clear he believed Keanu didn't belong in first class. Keanu, however, didn't react right away. He simply raised the bottle, took a small sip, and let a brief silence linger between them. His quiet confidence seemed to unnerve Victor, who shifted slightly in his seat. As the conversation continued, other passengers nearby began to take notice of the exchange. A few subtle glances were exchanged, and murmurs of curiosity spread through the cabin. It was clear that Victor's condescending remarks weren't going unnoticed, but Keanu's calm, measured responses only seemed to highlight the contrast between the two men. Several passengers began to take notice of Victor's increasingly provocative tone, but since Keanu appeared unbothered and composed, no one felt the need to intervene. It was as if his calm presence diffused the tension before it could escalate. Keanu finally broke the silence with his signature tranquility. "Maybe the best is different for everyone," he said, his voice steady and sincere. Victor didn't like the answer. He took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain control of the conversation. His ego wouldn't let him back down so easily. With a smug grin, he replied, "Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters. Some things are beyond the reach of certain people, you know." The words hung in the air, laced with an unmistakable condescension. Victor leaned back in his seat, satisfied with his response, convinced he had put Keanu in his place. Meanwhile, the flight attendant, who had been serving another passenger a few rows ahead, cast a discreet glance in their direction. She seemed to be considering whether to step in, sensing the growing tension. However, observing Keanu's calm and unshaken demeanor, she decided against it and continued with her duties, trusting that he could handle the situation on his own. Keanu took another sip of his water, his eyes fixed out the window, as if he were pondering something far more meaningful than the petty remarks thrown his way. His silence spoke volumes, and it was beginning to have an unexpected effect. Victor was starting to feel unsettled by his inability to provoke a reaction. The flight attendant, observing the interaction from a distance, considered stepping in but quickly realized that Keanu was handling the situation with effortless grace. Without a hint of irritation, he responded to Victor's latest remark with nothing more than a slight smile before turning back to gaze out the window, as if the conversation was already forgotten. Victor, however, wasn't satisfied. He had been trying to provoke Keanu for some time now, but it was becoming clear that the man sitting beside him was not easily rattled. Victor's usual tactics, condescension, arrogance, and veiled insults, seemed to slide right off Keanu like water off a duck's back. Despite his growing frustration, Victor remained convinced that he was winning this silent battle. In his mind, his wealth, status, and experience always gave him the upper hand in any situation. But what he failed to realize was that, to the other passengers around them, his arrogance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. People shifted in their seats, some exchanging quiet glances, while others pretended not to notice but were clearly paying attention. While Keanu's unshakable composure radiated a quiet confidence, Victor's relentless need to assert himself only highlighted his insecurities. Little did Victor know, he was about to face a reality that would completely change his perspective on what it truly means to belong. The lesson unfolding before him was one he never expected to receive. especially not from the man he had so quickly judged. People around them continued to observe quietly, sensing the tension building in the air. The flight attendant returned to the section of the cabin where Keanu and Victor were seated, gracefully serving another round of drinks. As she leaned in to pour champagne into Victor's glass, he took it as another opportunity to continue his string of provocations. "You know," Victor began, swirling the golden liquid in his glass with an air of self-importance. "Life is a lot like flying first class. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it." He paused for effect, casting a pointed glance at Keanu. "But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky." Keanu, who had been quietly minding his own business, placed his water bottle gently on the seat tray in front of him. Slowly, he turned to face Victor, his expression as calm as ever. But this time, there was something different in his gaze. A quiet intensity, a subtle firmness that hinted at a deeper wisdom beneath his composed exterior. Victor noticed the change, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Keanu didn't rush his response. Instead, he let the silence linger just long enough to make Victor slightly uncomfortable. The energy in the cabin seemed to shift. While Victor had expected another passive response, Keanu's unwavering gaze suggested that he had something meaningful to say, something that could no longer be ignored. There was something different in Keanu's gaze now, something deeper, as if he was finally ready to respond more directly. His calm exterior remained, but his words carried a weight that Victor hadn't expected. "Luck or hard work," Keanu said in a serene yet firm tone. "We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" The words hung in the air, settling over the cabin like a quiet revelation. The passengers who had previously been discreet in their observations now began to pay closer attention. The cabin, once filled with soft murmurs and the clinking of glasses, grew almost uncomfortably silent. A few exchanged subtle glances, noticing the tension in the air, the subtle yet undeniable clash between the two men. Victor forced a smile, though it was clear he was taken aback. He shifted in his seat, trying to mask the fact that Keanu's words had struck a chord somewhere deep within him. With a nervous chuckle, he replied, "Well, I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone can understand what it means to be truly successful." Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he simply leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, as if he had heard these words 1,000 times before. Victor, sensing the growing interest of the passengers around them, straightened his posture, determined to regain control of the conversation. But for the first time, a hint of doubt flickered in his eyes. Victor leaned back with an air of superiority, his smirk unwavering. "On a higher level," he repeated, savoring the words. "Not everyone understands the value of being here." He gestured around the luxurious cabin, emphasizing the exclusivity of their surroundings. Keanu, still calm and composed, leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms in a relaxed yet assertive manner. "I think the value of being here," he said, gesturing around their first-class seats, "isn't about what you have, but how you treat others." The phrase hung in the air, heavy with meaning, an undeniable truth that seemed to ripple through the cabin. A few passengers, who had been quietly observing, nodded in agreement, while others exchanged approving glances. The energy in the space subtly shifted, and for the first time, Victor appeared uncomfortable. He forced a chuckle, trying to brush off the weight of Keanu's words. "That's a good one," he said, his voice slightly strained. "First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should write a book." Despite his attempt at humor, the nervousness in his tone was becoming more apparent. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his cufflinks, but the confidence he had exuded earlier was beginning to falter. The quiet support from other passengers and Keanu's unwavering composure were making it increasingly difficult for him to maintain his illusion of control. Victor smirked, trying to regain his composure. "You should consider giving motivational talks," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, hoping to get a rise out of Keanu. But Keanu simply offered a short, polite smile and turned back to face forward, effectively ending the conversation without another word. His silence carried more weight than any rebuttal could, and it was clear to everyone around them who had truly won the exchange. The passengers began to react subtly. Some whispered quietly to one another, exchanging amused glances, while others shot Victor looks of quiet disapproval. His arrogance, once a source of confidence, was now working against him, and he could feel the judgment growing around him. A couple seated a few rows behind, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stole a discreet glance at Keanu. They appeared to recognize him, but chose to respect his privacy, refraining from any intrusion. However, their expressions betrayed a clear admiration for the way he had handled the situation with such effortless grace and dignity. Victor, on the other hand, was beginning to realize that his usual bravado wasn't having the desired effect. The tension in his shoulders betrayed the discomfort he now felt under the weight of his own words. The couple seated a few rows behind continued to admire the way Keanu handled the situation, with patience, grace, and an undeniable quiet confidence. They exchanged knowing looks, silently acknowledging the lesson unfolding before them. Meanwhile, Victor was starting to feel the weight of the passengers' gazes. He began to notice that he was being watched, and not in the way he was used to. The admiration he typically commanded was absent, replaced instead with disapproval and quiet judgment. The whispers, the subtle glances, the knowing nods, they all pointed to one undeniable truth. He was losing control of the situation. His posture, once upright and self-assured, shifted slightly. He crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, adjusting his tie needlessly. He could feel the heat creeping up his neck, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit defeat just yet. He was still convinced he could regain control, still believed he was winning this unspoken battle of status and superiority. But what Victor didn't realize was that the reactions around him told a very different story. The more he spoke, the more he revealed about himself, and the less impressive he seemed in comparison to the quiet, self-assured presence of the man sitting beside him. He didn't yet know that what was coming next would challenge everything he believed about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant walked down the aisle, collecting empty glasses, Victor saw his opportunity to redirect the conversation, to reclaim his perceived dominance. He cleared his throat, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to launch yet another remark, unaware that the lesson he was about to learn would be one he'd never forget. Victor, still determined to win the debate he had started, refused to back down. He leaned in slightly, a smug grin creeping across his face. "You know what's funny?" he said, swirling the last drops of champagne in his glass. "People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever noticed that?" Keanu didn't react with irritation or defensiveness. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, meeting Victor's gaze with a calm intensity that made the air feel heavier. "I've noticed," Keanu said, his voice steady, "that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside." The words landed with an undeniable weight, hanging in the air like an inescapable truth. A few passengers nearby glanced up from their screens or books, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding exchange. Victor, momentarily stunned, opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. It was as if Keanu's words had struck something deeper than he was willing to admit. He struggled to find a clever retort, but his usual wit seemed to have abandoned him. The silence stretched between them, and Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing for a way to regain his footing. Keanu, meanwhile, simply leaned back, his expression calm and unbothered, as if he already knew the outcome of this conversation. The tension in the cabin grew palpable, and the realization that Victor might not be as in control as he had thought slowly began to settle in. Victor struggled to form the right words, his confidence visibly shaken. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, some impressed, others amused by the way Keanu had effortlessly deflected Victor's provocations without breaking a sweat. Finally, Victor cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the conversation. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," he said, his voice less assured than before, "but the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." Keanu leaned back in his seat, his expression remaining calm and thoughtful. "Maybe," he replied, his voice steady, "but I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." His words carried a quiet power, rippling through the cabin like a gentle yet undeniable truth. A few passengers nodded discreetly, clearly agreeing with Keanu's perspective. They admired his ability to respond with such poise and wisdom, while Victor's aggressive need for validation seemed to grow increasingly uncomfortable to witness. Victor, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, forced a smile and glanced around, noticing the growing number of onlookers. The dynamic between him and Keanu had subtly changed, and for the first time, he realized that his approach might not be working in his favor. Despite his efforts to maintain composure, the truth behind Keanu's words lingered in his mind, challenging his long-held beliefs about status, power, and self-worth. Some passengers nodded in agreement with Keanu's words, while others shot disapproving glances at Victor, who was clearly not accustomed to being challenged in this way. His usual confidence was starting to waver under the weight of Keanu's quiet wisdom. By this point, the atmosphere in first class had noticeably shifted. Many passengers were no longer focused on their own affairs, but were now fully tuned into the unfolding exchange between Keanu and Victor. An older gentleman seated nearby turned to observe more closely, shaking his head in silent disapproval of Victor's behavior. Victor, feeling the weight of the stares around him, tried to mask his irritation with an awkward smile. He adjusted his cufflinks and sat up straighter, but the unease in his posture betrayed him. Yet, instead of backing down, he doubled down on his approach, throwing out another jab. "Cheap philosophy," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way." His voice, though still laced with arrogance, carried a hint of defensiveness now, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince Keanu. Keanu remained unfazed. He turned his gaze back to Victor, his expression calm but unwavering. There was no need for rebuttal. His presence alone seemed to challenge everything Victor thought he knew. Keanu looked at Victor with the same tranquil expression, his gaze steady and composed. Without missing a beat, he responded in his signature calm tone. "The real world is made by people, Victor. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else." Victor visibly tensed at Keanu's words, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced around the cabin and quickly realized that the passengers' attention was no longer in his favor. What once felt like an audience admiring his confidence now seemed more like a jury silently judging him. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared directly at him, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open disapproval. For the first time, Victor felt the weight of his own words pressing down on him. He had entered this exchange believing he could assert his dominance, but now he was beginning to realize that his usual tactics weren't working. No matter how hard he tried to reassert control, Keanu's unwavering composure and quiet wisdom had subtly shifted the power dynamic in the cabin. He thought he was winning. After all, wealth and status had always guaranteed him the upper hand in social situations. But now, as the murmurs around him grew and Keanu remained effortlessly at ease, Victor began to understand that perhaps success wasn't about what he had always believed. Victor had always believed he held the upper hand in conversations like this, where wealth, power, and status could easily overshadow others. But something about Keanu's words was different. They weren't just changing the perception of the passengers. They were starting to chip away at his own beliefs, leaving him feeling unexpectedly vulnerable. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Victor crossed his arms tightly, attempting to mask the discomfort caused by Keanu's words, but the irritation in his eyes and the stiffness in his posture betrayed him. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the weight of the unspoken judgment around him. Keanu, on the other hand, remained completely unaffected by the atmosphere. His calm energy never wavered. After a moment of silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, Keanu turned to Victor and spoke in his usual composed tone. "You know, Victor," he said gently, "I understand what you're saying. The world can be very competitive." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper." Victor's brow furrowed as he listened, sensing the conversation turning into something more personal than he had anticipated. Keanu's words carried a quiet truth that was difficult to ignore, and for the first time, Victor found himself at a loss for a clever comeback. Keanu's words hung in the air, their meaning settling deeply. "Something deeper," he continued, his voice steady. "An insecurity, an inner struggle." Victor furrowed his brow, momentarily caught off guard. He wasn't sure if Keanu was trying to provoke him or genuinely engaging in conversation. His instinct was to push back, to laugh it off and reclaim his sense of control. "Inner struggle?" he scoffed, forcing a chuckle. "I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong." His voice carried a defensive edge, but the confidence behind it was wavering. Keanu gave a slight, understanding smile and shook his head. "Maybe," he said calmly, "but I've met many people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to fill something missing inside them." Victor's forced smile faltered as Keanu's words hit him in an unexpected way. A silence stretched between them, heavier than before. Victor's eyes flickered downward, his fingers instinctively reaching for the wedding band on his finger. He began fiddling with it absent-mindedly, a telltale sign that something Keanu had said struck a nerve. For a brief moment, his carefully curated persona of success and control seemed to crack, revealing something more vulnerable beneath the surface. But just as quickly, he forced himself to brush it off, unwilling to admit, even to himself, that Keanu's words carried weight. Victor continued fiddling with his wedding band almost absent-mindedly, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. But within seconds, he snapped back, quickly recovering his defensive tone. "That's not me," he said firmly, his voice laced with irritation. "Everything I've achieved, I worked hard for it. I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." His words were sharp, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. Keanu remained calm, his expression thoughtful, as if he were carefully choosing his next words. He observed Victor for a few seconds, letting the weight of the conversation settle before speaking again. "I'm not saying you didn't work hard," Keanu replied evenly. "I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of showing off what we've achieved that we forget to look inward." He gestured subtly around them. "Who are we without all of this?" Victor pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable with the question. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate retort. He shifted in his seat, avoiding Keanu's gaze as he struggled to come up with a response that would maintain his sense of control. The silence between them grew heavier, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Victor was actually considering Keanu's words that had begun to chip away at the foundation of what he had always believed about himself and his success. Victor shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Keanu's question seemed to echo in his mind, challenging beliefs he had held onto for years. But he wasn't ready to admit that it struck a chord. "Who are we?" Victor repeated, letting out a cynical laugh. "We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing." His voice carried a hint of defiance, as if he were trying to convince both Keanu and himself of the truth in his words. Keanu held Victor's gaze, his expression now more serious, his usual softness replaced by a quiet conviction. "I disagree," he said firmly. "I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate." He paused for a moment, then pointed to his chest. "In the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside." His words resonated throughout the cabin, and the atmosphere shifted once again. Some passengers, who had been silently listening, nodded subtly in agreement. A few exchanged quiet glances, their expressions thoughtful, as if Keanu's words had struck a chord with them as well. Victor, on the other hand, appeared to struggle with the response. He opened his mouth slightly as if to counter, but no words came. He looked around, sensing the subtle shift in the room. The way people were now looking at Keanu with admiration and at him with something else entirely. Victor struggled to maintain his composure. His usual confidence was slipping, and the calm, measured way Keanu spoke only made it harder to keep up his facade. Frustration bubbled beneath the surface, and he nearly rose from his seat in protest. "That's easy for you to say," Victor shot back, his voice laced with irritation. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here." His tone was defensive, almost pleading, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as Keanu. Keanu, however, remained completely composed. He responded firmly, but without raising his voice. "You're right, Victor," he said. "I don't know your story." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "But I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes, when someone feels the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're trying to hide something." Victor's breath caught in his throat. Keanu's next words hit him like a brick. Fear, insecurity, loneliness. For the first time, Victor froze. His face flushed with color as the truth behind Keanu's words settled in. He opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. The cabin seemed to grow quieter as passengers, sensing the shift in the conversation, watched in silent anticipation. Victor's hands clenched into fists on his lap, his knuckles white as he struggled to find something, anything, to say in response. But deep down, he knew that Keanu's words had struck a nerve he wasn't ready to confront. Anger, and perhaps a tinge of shame, flashed across Victor's face. He clenched his fists tightly, his knuckles whitening as he struggled to contain the rising frustration within him. But it was clear that Keanu's words had struck too deep. Unable to hold it in any longer, Victor finally lost his composure. He stood up abruptly, knocking his empty champagne glass to the floor with a sharp clatter. The sound echoed through the cabin, drawing the attention of every passenger. "You think you're better than me?" Victor shouted, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and desperation. His eyes burned with resentment as he pointed an accusatory finger at Keanu. "Sitting there with your clever little phrases, acting like you know everything about life. But you don't know a thing about what it's like to live in the real world." The entire first-class cabin fell into an eerie silence. Passengers, once whispering and exchanging discreet glances, now stared openly, their expressions ranging from shock to disapproval. A flight attendant quickly approached, her professional demeanor intact, but concern evident in her eyes. "Sir, please lower your voice," she said firmly, yet politely, her gaze darting between Victor and Keanu. Meanwhile, Keanu remained seated, his expression unchanged. He didn't flinch at Victor's outburst, nor did he respond immediately. Instead, he observed him with the same steady, patient gaze, one that seemed to pierce through the anger and see something deeper beneath it. Victor, breathing heavily, suddenly realized the weight of the attention now fixated on him. The tension in the air was palpable, and his moment of anger had only served to highlight the very insecurities he was trying to hide. The flight attendant stood nearby, trying to diffuse the situation with a calm yet firm presence. Meanwhile, Keanu remained seated, looking at Victor with the same unshakable composure. He waited patiently for Victor to finish his outburst, offering no reaction to the anger that had been thrown his way. When the cabin had settled into an uneasy silence, Keanu finally spoke. His voice was firm, yet gentle, free of judgment. "I don't think I'm better than you," he said, his eyes steady and sincere. "I just think that sometimes we need to stop and think about what really matters. And Victor, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words hung in the air, their impact undeniable. Victor, still breathing heavily, felt something shift within him. There was no condescension in Keanu's voice, no smugness, only an invitation to reflect, to reconsider. For a moment, Victor's gaze flickered across Keanu's face, searching for any sign of mockery or superiority. Finding none, he slowly exhaled and almost involuntarily sank back into his seat. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on his expensive slacks, his earlier confidence now replaced by something much closer to doubt. He averted his gaze, no longer able to meet Keanu's eyes, and instead stared at the floor. The rage that had fueled him moments ago had faded, leaving behind exhaustion and an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. Passengers around them continued to watch in silence, some shifting uncomfortably, others looking on with quiet approval of Keanu's composed demeanor. Victor, once so sure of himself, now sat looking more defeated than angry. The realization that he had been fighting a battle no one else was invested in had finally begun to dawn on him. Silence settled over the cabin like a thick fog. Keanu's words echoed in Victor's mind, repeating over and over again. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in front of so many people. It was a discomfort he wasn't used to, one that stripped away the armor he had carefully built over the years. But what Victor didn't realize was that the worst, or perhaps the best, was yet to come. The flight continued in a heavier silence. The once lively hum of quiet conversations and clinking glasses seemed distant now. Victor remained in his seat, his eyes fixed on a random point ahead, avoiding any glance toward Keanu. But his unease was evident. His stiff posture, the occasional tightening of his jaw, and the way he fidgeted with his watch all betrayed the turmoil within. Keanu, on the other hand, sat completely relaxed as if nothing had happened. He gazed out the window, lost in thought, his calm presence in stark contrast to the tension radiating from Victor. There was no need for him to prove anything. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. A short while later, the flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite smile. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently, her voice cutting through the silence and drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "The captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Reeves seemed to ripple through the cabin like an unexpected revelation. Passengers who had been quietly observing suddenly widened their eyes, some exchanging surprised glances, others whispering among themselves. Victor, still avoiding eye contact, stiffened as realization dawned on him. "Keanu Reeves?" he muttered under his breath, his eyes finally flickering toward the man he had spent so much energy trying to put down. The entire first-class cabin seemed to pause as the flight attendant's words echoed through the air. "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Reeves rippled through the cabin like a sudden jolt. Passengers who had been quietly observing the earlier exchange widened their eyes in surprise. A murmur began to spread, hushed whispers traveling from seat to seat as recognition dawned. Some turned their heads discreetly, while others exchanged knowing glances, realization settling in. Victor froze, his mind racing to catch up with what he had just heard. "Reeves?" he murmured under his breath, almost in disbelief. His face paled as he blinked rapidly, staring at the man sitting beside him as if seeing him for the first time. "Keanu Reeves?" Keanu, ever composed, simply nodded politely to the flight attendant and thanked her in his usual soft-spoken manner. He didn't acknowledge the growing commotion around him, nor did he seem concerned by the newfound attention. Instead, he turned to Victor, his expression as calm and kind as ever. "Is something wrong, Victor?" Keanu asked with a slight smile, his voice carrying no trace of arrogance, just genuine curiosity. Victor opened his mouth but found himself at a loss for words. His mind raced through all the condescending remarks he had made earlier, each one now feeling heavier with embarrassment. He glanced around, realizing that the passengers who had been silently judging him were now more focused on Keanu with admiration and awe. Victor now looked at Keanu as if he were seeing a ghost. His once confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by wide eyes and a slack jaw. "Is something wrong, Victor?" Keanu asked with a slight smile, his voice calm and composed, free of any trace of smugness. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, and his mind scrambled to process what he had just learned. He glanced around the cabin, realizing that nearly every passenger was now observing him with curious, if not outright disapproving glances. Suddenly, he felt completely exposed. The same crowd he had once wanted to impress now seemed to be silently judging him, their expressions ranging from amusement to quiet disappointment. His confidence, so carefully curated, was crumbling under the weight of his embarrassment. Victor sank deeper into his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He nervously fidgeted with his tie, his fingers trembling slightly as he struggled to justify his earlier behavior. I had no idea, he stammered, his voice weak and uncertain. I mean, you didn't say who you were. Keanu kept his tone calm, his gaze unwavering yet kind. I didn't know that you were you, Victor finally blurted out, his words coming out in a rushed, awkward jumble. Keanu simply nodded, his expression as gentle as ever. I didn't think it was necessary, he said quietly. I don't usually introduce myself with my name. The words carried a quiet power that left Victor speechless once again. He glanced away, his earlier bravado now feeling foolish in the face of Keanu's humility. The silence stretched between them, and for the first time in a long while, Victor had nothing to say. There was a quiet firmness in Keanu's words as he responded, I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card. His voice was calm but carried a depth that made it clear he lived by those words. Victor remained silent for a moment, his mind racing to salvage what was left of his dignity. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. Look, I didn't mean to offend you, he stammered. I didn't know who I was talking to. Keanu let out a small sigh and leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady but not unkind. Victor, he said gently, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. Victor swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Keanu's words pressing down on him. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to, Keanu continued. It depends on how you choose to treat people. The words hit Victor like a ton of bricks, cutting through his carefully crafted facade. He blinked rapidly, his face flushed with embarrassment, and for the first time, he found himself truly reflecting on his actions. Passengers nearby exchanged knowing glances, and a few nodded in quiet agreement. The message was clear. Keanu's humility and wisdom had not only humbled Victor, but had left an impression on everyone in the cabin. Victor, however, remained frozen in his seat, realizing that his earlier assumptions about status and worth had been completely shattered. Victor sat speechless, staring at Keanu, then at the other passengers who were now even more attentive to what was unfolding. The humiliation on his face was undeniable. The weight of Keanu's words and the silent judgment of those around him pressed down heavily, stripping away the false confidence he had so carefully maintained. The silence in the cabin lingered, thick with unspoken thoughts and realizations. Finally, Keanu, sensing it was time to bring the conversation to a close, spoke again, his voice gentle but firm, carrying the weight of a lesson Victor wouldn't soon forget. You know, Victor, Keanu said, leaning forward slightly. Life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down just to make themselves feel bigger. Victor's jaw tensed, and he nodded slightly, unable to argue. For the first time, his expression softened, and there was a flicker of something new in his eyes. Introspection. The arrogance that had defined him just moments ago seemed to fade as he quietly absorbed Keanu's words. The tension in his shoulders eased as he glanced around at the watching passengers, now seeing them through a different lens. The subtle nods and quiet gazes of approval directed toward Keanu made him realize how much his own actions had alienated him. Keanu leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms comfortably, as if signaling that the conversation was truly over. He gazed out the window again, completely at peace, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. Victor exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. For the first time in a long time, he found himself reflecting, not on his wealth or status, but on who he truly was without them. Keanu leaned back in his seat, effectively ending the conversation. His posture was relaxed, his gaze once again fixed on the clouds outside, as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Victor remained motionless, staring down at his hands, his mind replaying every word of their exchange. He wasn't just confronted by Keanu. He was confronted by reality itself. For the first time, Victor began to realize that in his attempt to humiliate someone else, he had in fact revealed more about himself than he had ever intended. His insecurities, his need for validation, and his misguided perception of success had all been laid bare for everyone to see. The rest of the flight was marked by a heavy silence. No more smug remarks, no more forced laughter, just quiet contemplation. Victor, who once seemed to own the space with his presence, now looked visibly uncomfortable. His once confident posture had collapsed, and he could barely bring himself to meet the eyes of Keanu or the other passengers. The arrogance he had carried so effortlessly at the start of the journey now felt like a heavy burden, one he wasn't sure how to carry anymore. He shifted in his seat, his hands fidgeting with his cufflinks, but it was clear. Something inside him had shifted. Keanu, however, remained at ease, radiating the same quiet wisdom that had unraveled Victor's carefully constructed image. The lesson had been delivered, and it didn't need any further reinforcement. The truth spoke for itself. The arrogance Victor had carried so effortlessly at the start of the journey had disappeared, replaced by something much closer to shame. His usual sense of superiority, once a source of pride, now felt hollow and misplaced. As the minutes passed, he couldn't stop thinking about Keanu's words. They were so simple, yet they struck deeply, cutting through his carefully crafted defenses and forcing him to confront a reality he had long ignored. Victor's mind raced through countless memories, replaying past encounters where he had judged people without ever truly knowing them. How many times had he dismissed someone based on their appearance or perceived social status? How often had he sought validation through material things rather than meaningful connections? Maybe he's right, Victor murmured to himself without realizing it, his voice barely audible. He glanced at Keanu, who was now calmly reading a book, completely at ease as if their conversation had never even happened. Keanu's ability to remain unaffected, to move on without holding on to resentment or needing validation, only amplified the impact of the situation. Victor swallowed hard, realizing that while he had been so focused on proving his worth to others, Keanu had simply existed, comfortable in who he was, without the need to flaunt anything. For the first time in a long while, Victor felt the stirring of self-doubt. Not the kind that breeds insecurity, but the kind that pushes for growth and self-reflection. Keanu hadn't made any effort to prove himself throughout the entire exchange. He had simply let his actions and his calm demeanor speak for him. There was no need for flashy words or defensive arguments. His quiet confidence was enough to leave a lasting impact. As the plane began to prepare for landing, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Victor, still lost in thought, glanced over at Keanu once more. The weight of his earlier behavior sat heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time, he felt the need to address it. Finally, mustering the courage to speak, he turned to Keanu, his eyes still lowered in humility. I need to apologize, Victor said, his voice quieter than usual. He swallowed hard before continuing. Not for what I said, just because you're you, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot. Keanu looked at him, his expression as tranquil as ever. He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he let the moment breathe, allowing Victor's words to settle in the air. After a brief pause, Keanu nodded. I appreciate the apology, he said gently. But more than that, I hope you learn from this." Victor nodded slowly, the words sinking in deeper than he expected. He realized that this encounter had been more than just an embarrassing moment. It had been a wake-up call, a rare opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to reevaluate what truly mattered. As the plane continued its descent, Victor sat in silence, replaying everything in his mind. For the first time in a long while, he felt a desire to change, to be better, not for the approval of others, but for himself. Keanu's words lingered in the air, an opportunity for change that Victor couldn't ignore. Then, in his usual calm, yet insightful tone, Keanu continued, "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor remained silent, absorbing the weight of those words. He didn't respond, but deep down, he knew they had struck a chord within him. It was a rare moment of self-awareness, an invitation to reflect and perhaps even change if he allowed himself to. As the plane landed and passengers began disembarking, Victor moved through the terminal feeling different, lighter, yet burdened by the realization of his own shortcomings. He stood still for a moment, watching Keanu walk away effortlessly, blending into the crowd without any need for attention or validation. Fans discreetly approached Keanu, some hesitantly, others with wide smiles. Without hesitation, Keanu greeted each one with patience and a genuine smile, taking time to engage with them, signing autographs and posing for pictures without a hint of annoyance or pretension. It was clear that his humility wasn't an act, it was simply who he was. Victor watched in awe, realizing that the very thing he had tried to diminish in Keanu earlier, his simplicity, his humility, was the very thing that made him truly remarkable. It wasn't the fame or fortune that made Keanu special, but the way he treated others, with kindness and authenticity. For the first time in a long while, Victor questioned his own values and what he had been striving for all these years. Perhaps, he thought, it was time to redefine what success really meant. Without haste or arrogance, Keanu continued through the terminal, his every interaction marked by an effortless grace. It was evident that his simplicity and kindness weren't a carefully constructed image, but something that came from within. Genuine, sincere, and unwavering. Victor looked down at his own hands and sighed, the weight of realization settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew he needed to change. The words Keanu had spoken still echoed in his mind, a powerful reminder that a person's true worth isn't defined by their status, wealth, or possessions, but by how they choose to treat others. As Keanu disappeared into the bustling airport crowd, blending seamlessly with ordinary travelers despite his global fame, Victor felt something stir inside him. Hope. For the first time in a long while, he entertained the thought that maybe this encounter hadn't been a coincidence. Maybe, just maybe, it was a much-needed chance to start over, to reevaluate his values and priorities. In the end, we all carry choices that shape who we are. Are we living to impress others, or to become better people? Victor stood there, watching the crowd move past him, realizing that true success wasn't about standing above others, but walking beside them. And with that realization, he took a deep breath and stepped forward, carrying with him the lesson that humility, respect, and kindness never go out of style. Keanu's words left a clear lesson imprinted in Victor's mind, one that extended far beyond their brief interaction. True success isn't about what you achieve or show off, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and the lives of those around you. As Victor stood there, absorbing the experience, he realized that everything he had once valued, wealth, power, and social status, paled in comparison to the simple, yet profound impact of kindness and humility. So the next time you find yourself in a situation of judgment or conflict, remember this: respect and humility never go out of style. The way we treat others speaks volumes about who we are, and perhaps The change we want to see in the world needs to start from within. Victor took one last glance into the crowd, feeling a newfound sense of clarity and purpose. He now understood that being truly successful meant being a better person, not just a wealthier one. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart and inspire you to see the world differently. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.